Every stunning image starts with understanding your camera. But let's be honest, understanding your camera settings can be a bit intimidating. You have shutter speed, aperture, ISO. I mean, what do these all even mean? Hey, I'm Kostas. I've been a professional photographer for the past decade, and in the next 10 minutes, my goal is to help you understand the basics of photography so you can go out in any scenario and capture amazing images. So with that being said, let's dive in. The first concept we're gonna be covering is the exposure triangle. Now, this is the foundation of photography. It's made up of three main settings, which all directly affect how your image turns out. These are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. They'll allow you to control light and get your image to look however you want, no matter the scene. Let's start with shutter speed. Shutter speed is simply how fast your camera shutter opens and closes when you take a photo. You'll typically see this camera setting displayed in the bottom left-hand corner of your camera. It's displayed in a fraction, so 1/125, 1/250, 1/500, and so forth. The larger the number after the 1, the faster the shutter speed. So why does this matter? Well, shutter speed determines two crucial things when it comes to photography. A faster shutter speed will allow you to freeze action and capture moving subjects sharply. And number two, your shutter speed determines how much motion blur you capture. A slower shutter will lead to more motion blur. Now, depending on the type of photo you're trying to take, that might be the look you're trying to go for stylistically, but more often than not, you're gonna wanna stick with a faster shutter speed. Now, something else you need to keep in mind when it comes to shutter speed is that as you increase your shutter speed, your shutter will stay open for a shorter amount of time, which means less light is let into your sensor, resulting in a darker image. So like we've talked about, faster shutter speeds are great for freezing the action, but because the image gets darker as you increase your shutter speed, you're gonna have to compensate with adjustments to both your aperture and ISO to maintain proper exposure. All right, now that we've got shutter speed down, let's move on to aperture. So aperture is the size of the opening in your camera lens that allows light to pass through. Aperture is represented as an F number on your camera, usually something like f2.8, f5.6, or f8 or f11. This might sound kind of counterintuitive, but the lower that number, the wider the opening is, which will allow more light and a brighter image. This also works in the opposite way. So if that number increases, the opening actually is smaller, which means less light is let in, and that results in a darker image. Now here's the thing, aperture doesn't just control how bright or dark your image is. It also controls what's called depth of field, or how much of your image is in focus. A wide aperture is gonna give you that nice, creamy, blurry background we all love. It's called bokeh, and this is great for portraits. But if you're shooting a scene where you want everything in focus, you're gonna wanna use a higher F number, because that's gonna give you a sharpness throughout your whole image. And lastly, we have ISO. ISO controls your camera sensitivity to light, but you can just think of it as like fake light for your camera. The lower you have your ISO, the less fake light your camera is gonna have, and this is gonna result in a darker image. A nice rule of thumb is to keep your ISO as low as possible. I understand that there's gonna be like low light situations where you're gonna have to bring in that fake light. However, keep in mind, as that ISO goes up, more noise or grain is introduced into your image. So a nice rule of thumb is try to keep your ISO as low as possible. Now, ISO really does come into play during those low light situations. I'll give you a perfect example. I was a touring concert photographer for about 3 years, and those clubs that I was shooting in are very dark. There's not a lot of light, so you have to crank that ISO, but I would typically be around 1600 to 3200 ISO. I found a good rule of thumb is that once you go past 3200 ISO, a lot of noise is introduced to your image. So if you are shooting in low light situations, try to keep your ISO between 1600 or 3200 ISO. You don't really want to go above 3200. Now, of course, different scenarios are going to call for different camera settings, and your job as a photographer is to find the balance between all of those settings to achieve the look you want while still maintaining proper exposure. Look, I know it can all sound confusing when you're first starting photography, but trust me, the more you practice, the easier it'll get. Practice changing those camera settings, achieving the looks you want as a photographer, and you'll be out there shooting like a pro in no time. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is lenses. I could talk about lenses all day. It can seem pretty overwhelming when you're first starting out because there's so many different kinds: wide angle, medium, telephoto, not to mention prime versus zooms. But don't worry, I'm going to break it down and make things simple for you. Now, different lenses can help you achieve different perspectives and moods. The same scene can be captured on two different lenses and evoke two different emotions. Let's start with the basics. We're going to start first with wide angle lenses. Now, these typically range anywhere from 10 millimeter to about 24 millimeter. These are great for when you want to fit a lot into one image. Think landscape or architecture. Wide angle lenses are great for creating a sense of space and depth in your image, but keep in mind that they might distort or warp the sides of your images. So while they're great for scenery, they're probably not going to be your go-to lens for portrait photography. Next up, we have medium focal length lenses. These are typically going to range between 35 and 70 mil. These are the versatile everyday lenses that are going to be great for street photography, events, and portraits. Now, fun fact, a 50 mil focal length is going to closely mimic what the human eye sees, so it's oftentimes a favorite focal length length for photographers, and most camera brands will offer a cheap 50mm focal length lens, which is often called a nifty 50. And lastly, let's talk about telephoto lenses. Now, these are typically my favorite lenses to shoot on. They range anywhere between 70 and 200mm or even beyond that. Telephoto lenses are great because they allow you to zoom in on your subject without actually moving closer. Because they compress the background as well, you'll get that smooth, creamy bokeh we're all looking for as photographers. When choosing the right lens for you, you want to think about what you're trying to emphasize in your shot. Are you trying to get a wide view of the entire scene, or do you really want to narrow in on a specific subject within that frame? Choosing the right lens is critical for how well you'll be able to tell the story you want as a photographer, so choose wisely. Look, I know it can be really overwhelming to decide which lens to get. If you don't know where to start, I would get a kit lens or a medium focal length zoom lens, so something like an 18-55 or 24-70. It'll give you both that wide angle, medium, and kind of tight when it comes to that 70mm. It'll allow you to experiment with a lot of different focal lengths and see which you like best. And that's pretty much it. You got your camera settings, you got the exposure triangle, you got shutter speed, aperture, ISO, different lenses. They all result in different looking images, but they all work cohesively together to get that image that you're looking for. My advice is just to grab your camera and a lens, go out and shoot different scenarios, change your camera settings, practice as much as you can, because the more you practice, the better you'll get. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of camera photography basics. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. We got a bunch of banger videos coming for you soon, and I'll see you guys in the next one.